But it must not be supposed that in the midst of all their tolls, the people who live in democracies think themselves to be pitied. The contrary is noticed to be the case. No men are fonder of their own condition. Life would have no relish for them if they were delivered from the anxieties which harass them, as they show more attachment to their cares than aristocratic nations to their pleasures. Welcome to Radio Tipping Point, and our show today is titled Freedom is Not Convenient. This was a quote from DeTocquevielle from the book he wrote, I'm going to take a guess, around 1830, 1820, titled Democracy in America. And DeTocquevielle was referring to tasks or duties that we have. And his idea tied to democracy is that it's all revolving around this concept of self-determination, which means by nature we are deciding freely what we do. We take responsibility for those decisions, and the joy that we receive by tending to these cares that he's referring to is the mastery that we achieve by getting better and better. And I found this quote to be quite indicative of how far we are from that ideal. In essence, those cares that DeTocquevielle refers to have become our pleasure, not too far removed from the aristocracy. A visit to your local supermarket would be the best example. Before, it was enough to make sure that we have enough to eat. And certainly within the Western world, our cares here have become much more of an experience. And the actual pleasure of these cares have been transformed into a particular state which has become the oil that greases the machine, and that would be consumption. We saw in the beginning of the first lockdown that all of a sudden there were activities tied to these cares which became quite popular. One notable example is baking bread. And my hope, certainly when we hit the first lockdown, is that once it would end, then we would all have much better appreciation for those things that truly hold meaning. And lo and behold, what were the first actions that we saw? Lines on the Marihilferstrasse waiting to get into stores such as H&M, and that people would take the whole family to go through the McDonald's drive-thru. And so these cares have truly become our pleasure. And we have other indicators. I'm not a television watcher myself, but I have noticed on those infrequent occasions that it appears to me, and perhaps I'm wrong, it seems as if every other show has something to do with preparing food or renovating a house. And with that, we have another example of how our cares have not only become our pleasure, that through this consumption, they have become our obsession. And if that alone was not bad enough, we can track how the concept of mastery is becoming a dying species. The ability to do something on your own and to thrive and understand why has often become a collection of how-to manuals. And if given the option, we would hope to have the inconvenient parts, well, pretty much take care of themselves. But folks, this malaise is even worse than that of what I've depicted so far. We have replaced the typical cares, those that DeTocquevielle was referring to. We have replaced them with new cares. And these cares are clear annoyances. And they have nothing to do with democracy. And here I'm referring to our relationship to each other. When I look through the horizon, I see a collection of relationships that have become almost like a transactional Rubik's Cube. Where our objective is to get to the finish line as quickly as possible, the joy of the actual relationship as such has become not so important. And that desire for insight, that desire that we had at one time, that being either new ideas or perhaps food for thought, looking at things from different perspectives, that has become yesterday's newspaper. We have no time. We see no value, and ergo have no desire to follow a path that would have us craving for the input of others. Instead, it's become the ubiquitous question, what can you do for me? And it can take on different forms. How can you help me make money? How can you help me get my tasks completed? How can you help me progress in my life? And when I think about it, usually within the form of a transaction, you perform some sort of actions and you are expected to get something in return. And I question to what degree often a number of individuals are left holding the bag, because that is their role in life. That is why they are here. That is what we expect of them. And they should continue to fulfill those tasks that are to be found within that stereotype. And that list is very long. When I think of the discussions that are currently taking place here in Austria, simply because those in power felt that they could not avoid the subject any longer. That they felt compelled to at least make some sort of statement tied to the care that is already a serious problem and will continue to get much worse. But at the same time, we feel no need, from a societal perspective, I'm not talking about you and me, from a societal perspective, we find no necessity to truly acknowledge the activities of certain groups within our society, and then we become surprised that a number of individuals within these groups, that they reach burnout, They decide that they no longer want to carry the role of the lackey of the nation. And they come to the conclusion that they too hold the freedom to make a choice. And after performing the evaluation of the various options, that we have reached the sorry state that they realize by just saying no, they have everything to gain and little to nothing to lose. I just finished performing an exercise desperately looking for individuals to participate in serious discussions tied to subjects that we all understand to be important, but we keep striving for that how-to manual. And let me give you an example of some of the subjects that I'm referring to. How about burnout? And we know that this problem has reached epidemic proportions. But I ask you quite frankly, how often do you hear conversations tied to the root cause, as the burnout is only the symptom? That is the result of something that took place beforehand. Burnout is not something that takes place when you enter a room like turning on the switch, but rather as a state of desperation where you see no way out. Here's another one we don't talk about quite often, virtually not at all. What about isolation and loneliness? It's one that I notice among the people that I cross in the streets daily. And no doubt, the results of the last 2 years have made that condition infinitely worse. But I ask you quite bluntly, how often do you hear honest conversations about these subjects where you have the feeling you are not being told what to do, you are not given an how-to manual? How do you solve your loneliness? How do you solve your isolation? How do you bounce back from burnout? How often do you run across those types of conversations that are not prescriptive, but those that are reflective, that allow us as individuals to receive some sort of indicator that we are not alone within this condition that some people hide it quite well. That perhaps by hearing the stories of others, understanding perhaps a little bit better of what the sources might be of how these afflictions rise to begin with. So within this quest to foster meaningful conversations where individuals are willing to be vulnerable and talk about things that really matter, I came across a very strong revelation, or realization is a better word, that today I am not sure if I can count the number of people that I believe would be ready to participate in these conversations. I'm not quite sure if I can count them on two hands. And I immediately thought, that cannot be right. So and very often because you are not in contact with everybody all the time, it's possible that you haven't heard from somebody in a while, but you know that if you were to reach out to them, it was like yesterday, and it would be no problem to continue the conversation pretty much where you left it, without any judgment, with the appreciation that we think of each other and the joy that we have each other. So I thought, well, let's go through some social media and start taking a look and seeing, so who could I have possibly forgotten? Well, the results were downright depressing, I have to tell you. I'm looking through these lists and I'm thinking, so who are these people? I have them as connections. I'm not even sure who they are. I couldn't tell you anything about them. I know for damn sure I cannot rely on any of these people, even the people I do recognize. And I came to a very sad realization. That these applications that we invest so much time in, and I'm speaking about yours truly, I truly have to question the value, if indeed I cannot name anything about any of these people. If I was gone, or if they were gone, let's put it this way, if they were gone, it's like a tree that falls in the forest. If nobody's there, will anybody notice? And our show is titled, Freedom is Not Convenient. And in fact, we do have the freedom to choose. We might not necessarily always like that choice, but we clearly have the freedom to choose. And we have unfortunately been so conditioned to automatically choose the most convenient option that we've passed on the ability or the capability to even recognize any value. And I think that was probably one of the biggest messages I received in performing that action. That I myself did not take the time to evaluate, so what is the value? And I'm not just referring to the value for me. But how about starting with the value for the others? I see this very often, not just in the virtual world, but also in the physical world. Another revelation that I have come to, that we have I was originally going to call this a business card, but it doesn't necessarily have to be business. Let's put it our calling card. So how can you reach me? I've come to the conclusion that we are going through some sort of pagan ritual that nobody really cares about. And if you haven't noticed, I'm in a bit of a reflective mood. And I've always tried to avoid rituals for fear, just for the fact that we don't perform these things without knowing why or expecting something different. So I've tried to reach out to anyone whose card I received with the intention, well, if we took the time to change cards, or exchange cards better said, then at least we should start with some sort of conversation. But I've noticed for a long time now that most people don't even bother having cards. So I've been left with the situation. I'll have the cards. They won't have anything. I won't have any ways to get in touch with these people. And I'm reliant upon them actually performing that action. And I'm afraid that over the years, well, you can guess. So it's not just the virtual world. This is an exercise that we've been performing within the physical world as well. And here's another one that I've noticed, that people will have an idea and then their plans will change, and you were supposed to fulfill some sort of function within that idea. And that's the reason why they reached out to you. Again, getting back to this transactional component. And so you've arranged the actual physical meaning, which is quite sensational today, because we've gotten used to keeping things ultra efficient and saving the time to go somewhere and saving the time to go back. And keeping our conversations to whatever the subject may be, so we time box it. Why, this has happened a few times, and perhaps you're familiar with this one as well. That people come back and say, "Oh yeah, we were supposed to meet. I forgot what it was about." And lo and behold, right before the meeting, then there seems to be this pre-meeting sickness that takes place. And then you never hear from them again. Or instead of looking to come up with something together, in other words, you have an idea and I'll have an idea, and together we should be able to create something much more meaningful than we could ever create on our own, simply because you are not me and I am not you. Well, that one seems to be a dying breed as well. Where if there's something that you want to do, you always have to put it together in the form of a pitch. That means that all components of your idea need to be completed, regardless of being able to vet the viability. And you'll get comments like, "I don't understand what you want to do. Explain it to me in a way that I can understand." Or this is one I heard as well. "Let me give you a tip. Reach out to Joe TikTok and get him on board. I don't know him, but he will give you street cred." Those are always uplifting conversations. Or you might get this one as well. "Yes, I did that once. Let me describe to you in infinite detail how I did it, why it was so fantastic, and why I am predestined to be the go-to person for anyone who wants to remotely come up with something that vaguely resembles your idea." And I ask you, is any of this supposed to bring some meaning? Especially considering that we know that it could work so much better. We know this. And part of the problem, you know, I make jokes about individuals, and I make jokes about myself. But if we keep putting people into categories, because it seems to be our only defense, then it's not quite clear what kind of value we're supposed to get out of that. And within the concept of the show, where I concentrate on empowerment and inclusiveness as being the prerequisites to achieve social transformation, think the examples that I've been giving you so far, or for the most part, have something to do with inclusiveness. The ability to truly recognize the abilities of others without typecasting them in fulfilling certain tasks that you need to have completed. Going back to the example I gave in the beginning, where I talk about what others can do for us in helping us making money or getting the job done, whatever it may be. Because in our pseudo-analysis, we have most likely confused the symptom to be the problem. Sorry, was I talking about climate change there? So we look for the individuals who are supposed to perform certain actions so that the symptom does not appear. But what we miss within these actions is taking the time to truly understand of what causes this malaise to begin with. Probably because they're way too deep-seated. They seem insurmountable. We feel helpless. And we run across a situation, once again, of where external components ruin our inner balance. But we know that this can be done different. We know this. We have plenty in common. Just being human and performing certain functions means that by nature we all have something in common. And going back to the concept from DeTocquevielle, tied to cares, that very possibly we might all be taking care of these cares, these tasks or duties, in a different way. Just the way that you've been doing it for so many years doesn't necessarily mean there isn't another way to complete these tasks. And you might even come to the conclusion that if you perform these tasks in a different fashion, they might have more meaning. Or maybe these tasks are clearly obligations that probably should be spared to begin with. There was a quote from Robert Putnam, who wrote a book titled Bowling Alone, and perhaps if you followed the show you might have heard me talking about this book. And Putnam says, citizenry is not a spectator sport. So if we were to look at the concept to be found within the impetus of the French Revolution, liberty, fraternity, and equality, you will understand that there is an interrelationship between these three components. And in fact, the key in reaching a higher state is to ensure that all three components are sustainable. Let me give you an example. And I think that these three have a lot to do with that of what I've been talking about so far, but I'll let you be the judge on that. Liberty can be equated to be freedom, the freedom to choose what you think is best. But within that choice that you make, there are some other things that we need to take into consideration. So if you skew this constellation because you only focus on the liberty part and you forget the fraternity and equality part, you shouldn't be too surprised if the liberty kind of gets dried up. And in fact, you could even say that any possible loss of freedom that we have is clearly tied to our negligence of the fraternity and the equality parts. Fraternity should not become an obligation, but should be freely chosen. Meaning within that fraternal relationship, it should be free. Meaning that each individual can decide for herself how intense that relationship should be. And there are all kinds of things that we can do to make sure that that fraternal relationship is meaningful. And that, my friends, is part of the decision that we make freely. So if you can imagine these three words within a triangle where they are all related to each other. We've talked about the liberty, and we have mentioned that the liberty without fraternity ruins the model. In the fraternity without a free choice, or the liberty, will also dry up. But the one part that we always seem to be missing is that equality part. Because we decide fraternity only for our side, and all the members on our side have liberty. But what we tend to forget, just like the example I gave earlier, of all those individuals in our society where we pretend that somebody gets something in return if it's transactional, but we know of a number of groups within our society who get very little back. And then we're surprised that they decide that it's not worth it for them anymore. Some don't have a choice. Just like the story I heard last week about Mother's Day, which I always think it's wonderful. Of all these groups that have to truly pay the price and have been paying the price for such a number of years, we think that we do them justice by giving them one day of the year, be it Women's Day or Mother's Day. And within this the story I heard, there was a mother who asked for Mother's Day to have some solitude. And I use this word on purpose, solitude. And she was immediately ridiculed because how can you do this to your children? They want to honor you. And I just think this story says it all. So, how vibrant is our society? Even if we are able to get the liberty and the fraternity part somewhat straightened out, but fraternity only for specific groups, and the liberty exists within those confines. And their liberty is at the cost of a number of individuals, a number of groups within our society. And of course, we've been doing this for a long, long time. But we shouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden we have our payday tipping points. This wheel spins, let me off. It's not for lack of trying. Can't put my finger on it. You can't help but being hard up. Can't trust the God we trusted. Don't think that there's any insurance. Could I be happy with something else? I need something to fill my time. Could I be happy with something else? I need someone to fill my time. And so back to that triangle that I described, the liberty, fraternity, inequality, constellation, where within a healthy society, there is held a balance between all three components. That we recognize the individuality of certain groups, that it exists within an egalitarian platform where people have the free will, but see it within their interest, within the structure that we're talking about. That the upholding the structure is the most important thing, so that we do not need to set rules on what people need to do, but rather this becomes self-apparent. Well, we've chosen a different path, and we chose it a long time ago, and every once in a while we will think that we're making progress, and then something comes up and I call the instrument that is used the candy-covered stick, and I'll tell you why. If we follow that natural reaction we have as human beings, tied to the choice, something to gain or something to lose, you can try this one at home. And in fact, what you have to gain could be infinitely much more beneficial, have more value than that of what you're losing. Our immediate reaction is we are going to stop our losses at all costs. And I catch myself doing this as well. It's a human reaction. But the powers that be use this vehicle in very uncanny ways. So what they'll do is there will be a threat. And we have some out there. The most prominent one is tied to energy, where those individuals not too long ago who were claiming that we need to solve the problem of global warming and we need to remove our reliance on fossil fuels. Well, watch how they are reacting these days. It would actually be funny if it wasn't so sickening. And there are a number of examples out there. I'll just pick one. Joe Biden, who is basically singing the song that we heard from 45 for such a long time, drill, baby, drill. And it's all tied to the idea what we're going to lose. If we do not have fossil fuels, then that means that our standard of living will collapse because we will not be able to have the economy grow anymore. And so we see very quickly that this is all an illusion. And the worst part about it is that we cannot have an open dialogue. And there are some exceptions. But what takes place is that they will hold the threat from the top and they'll steal from below. And I could see that this is a subject that requires much more scrutiny, than I originally realized. I'd like to close at least on a positive note. If we say that the model is tied to convenience and that we try to perform as little effort as possible to it because that is convenient. And that's how we judge what value is. I'd like to give you and of course it's all based on money because that's the only thing that we can use to denote value here. I'd like to give you this exercise and let you think about it a little bit. And then we'll continue with the subject the next time we have the show. What happens if you remove the word value from this constellation? So think of this as, again, being a triangle of convenience, effort, and value. If we remove value and we change the word to meaning, then would we agree that everything that's meaningful does not take an effort? I would argue the opposite. In fact, the things that are most meaningful don't always bring happiness. That sometimes they bring, anguish is a bit too strong of a word, but they cause us problems sometimes. And is meaning always reached in a quick and efficient manner? I would argue no. So perhaps if I can give this one to you as an exercise for you to perform, something for you to concentrate on till we get back together, I'd be very keen on what you're able to come up with. And I'm going to make a prediction. I suspect that you will find that those things that truly have meaning require a lot of effort and are not very convenient, but they make our life full. With that, I say thank you very much. I wish you a wonderful week. And thanks for allowing me to indulge in some of these ideas.